Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the world, emperor of Rome, commander of armies, ruler of millions of people across 3 continents. Yet every night he lay down just like anyone else. Every night he faced the same challenge that every human faces. The challenge of letting go of the day, of releasing control, of surrendering to sleep. And he wrote about it. His private journals, what we now call the meditations, were nighttime reflections, thoughts recorded at the end of long days, philosophy for an exhausted emperor trying to sleep despite the weight of empire, philosophy for a tired human trying to rest despite the weight of being human. These were not writings intended for publication, not speeches for the Senate, not proclamations for the people. These were private thoughts, personal reminders, bedtime philosophy written by a man who ruled the world but could not rule sleep itself, a man who commanded legions but could not command rest, a man who had absolute power over millions but had to surrender absolutely to sleep every night. What did Marcus know about sleep? What allowed the most powerful man in Rome to find peace enough to rest? Not because he solved all his problems. The problems of empire never ended. Not because Rome was perfect. Rome was never perfect. But because he understood something fundamental about sleep, about release, about accepting the day that is ended, and the darkness that comes. Before we explore what Marcus knew, if you find value in these ancient philosophies applied to modern sleep, if these explorations help you find peace at the end of your day, consider subscribing. Marcus Aurelius had no subscribe button. He wrote for himself, never imagining that 2,000 years later, people would read his nighttime thoughts. But if you would like more of these philosophical approaches to sleep, to rest, to finding peace in an exhausting world, the option exists. There is no cosmic reason to subscribe. No universal imperative, but if you prefer more guides to resting like the ancients, the button is there. Now the exploration of Stoic sleep wisdom begins. This is an examination of what an emperor knew about sleeping, what a philosopher practiced about resting, what a Stoic understood about surrendering to the night, long enough to examine ancient wisdom, long enough to explore deep philosophy, long enough to understand what Marcus Aurelius knew about sleeping peacefully despite carrying the world. Marcus would begin his evening by acknowledging what existed outside his control, and the answer was simple. Everything. Almost everything. He ruled Rome, but he could not control Rome. He commanded armies, but he could not control the outcomes of battles. He issued orders, but he could not control how those orders would be executed. He made decisions, but he could not control the consequences of those decisions. This recognition was his first step toward sleep, understanding what belonged to him and what did not, what was his responsibility and what was not, what required his concern and what required his release. He owned his mind, his judgments about events, his responses to situations, his character as expressed through his choices, his intentions behind his actions. This was his domain, a small domain for an emperor, but the only domain that actually belonged to him. Everything else existed outside his control. The empire, the people, the events, the outcomes, the consequences, the results, the reactions of others, all of it outside his control, all of it requiring release. Most people are not emperors. Most people do not rule millions. Most people do not command armies. But every person faces the same fundamental challenge that Marcus faced. Every person spends their day trying to control things they cannot control, trying to influence outcomes they cannot influence, trying to make reality different than it is, trying to change what cannot be changed. And at the end of the day, exhausted and depleted, they lie down, carrying the weight of all that trying. What things cannot be controlled? Other people's opinions, other people's actions, other people's reactions to your actions, events that unfold in the world, outcomes of situations you participate in, consequences of decisions you make, the past that has already happened, the future that has not yet happened, all of it outside human control, all of it beyond individual power, all of it requiring acceptance rather than resistance. Marcus wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This realization was his bedtime practice, his nightly return to what actually belonged to him, his acceptance of everything else as existing outside his domain. What belongs to any person? Their thoughts about events, their judgments about what happens, their responses to situations, their choices about how to interpret their experiences, their decisions about what meaning to assign to their day. These things belong to the individual. These things exist within their control. Everything else, what others do, what others say, what happens in the world, what does not happen, how things turn out, what consequences emerge, all of this exists outside individual control. All of it beyond personal power. All of it requiring acceptance rather than resistance. This is not resignation. This is not giving up. This is not passivity. This is accurate assessment of reality. Marcus did not give up trying to rule Rome well. He gave up thinking he could control Rome. The difference is crucial. He acted where he could act, in his responses, his decisions, his character, his intentions. He accepted what he could not control, which was everything else, all outcomes, every consequence. This distinction between what can be controlled and what cannot be controlled is what allowed Marcus to sleep, what enabled him to rest, what permitted him to surrender to darkness each night. Every person acts during their day. They do things, they make choices, they respond to situations, they speak words, they make decisions, they take actions, they form intentions, they express their character. These actions belong to them. These choices are theirs. These responses are their own. But the outcomes, those are not theirs. The consequences, those are not theirs. The results, those are not theirs. How others receive their actions, that is not theirs. How situations unfold after their participation, that is not theirs. Only the actions themselves, only the choices, only the responses, only the intentions. These belong to the individual. And having acted, having chosen, having responded, having intended, a person can release, can let go, can surrender, can accept that they did what they could with what they controlled, and everything else unfolded according to its own nature, not according to their will. The physical body releases tension when a person lies down to sleep. The muscles relax, the breathing slows, the heart rate decreases. This physical release mirrors the mental release that Marcus practiced. He released control over outcomes. He released attachment to results. He released his demands for particular consequences. He released everything outside his small domain of mind and character. Consider specific events from any given day, specific interactions, specific situations, specific challenges. For each one, the Stoic question applies. What was actually controlled? Only the individual's part in it, only their response, only their intention, only their character in that moment, not the other person's response, not the situation's outcome, not the event's ultimate meaning, not the consequence that emerged, just the personal participation, just the individual response, just the specific choice, just the particular intention. This narrowing down to what can actually be controlled is liberating. It removes false responsibility. It removes imaginary power that was never actually possessed. It removes the burden of controlling what cannot be controlled. The emperor who could command legions learned that he could not command reality itself. He could not make people behave as he wished. He could not prevent problems from arising. He could not control the outcomes of his decisions. He could only control his mind, his judgments about events, his responses to situations, his character in the face of challenges. And having controlled what he could, having governed his small domain, he released everything else into darkness, into fate, into what the Stoics called the logos, the rational order of the universe that proceeds regardless of individual will. This release is what allows sleep, not solving problems, because problems persist whether a person sleeps or not. Not controlling outcomes, because outcomes unfold whether a person rests or not. Not fixing situations, because situations develop whether a person is conscious or not. But releasing what was never within control to begin with, accepting what is, surrendering to the nature of reality. The universe operates according to patterns that exist beyond human control. The Stoics called this the logos, the rational principle that governs all things. Marcus understood that he could not control this universal order. He could not bend reality to his will. He could not make the cosmos operate according to his preferences. He could only control his response to reality, his judgment about what happened, his character in the face of what he could not change. And understanding this, truly understanding this, allowed him to sleep, allowed him to release the day, allowed him to stop trying to control what could never be controlled, allowed him to rest in the small sovereignty he actually possessed, the sovereignty over his own mind, and to surrender everything else to the nature of things. The human mind has a tendency to believe it has more control than it actually possesses. It believes it can control other people if it just says the right thing. It believes it can control outcomes if it just tries hard enough. It believes it can control the future if it just plans carefully enough. But this is an illusion, a comforting fiction, a false belief that creates suffering when reality inevitably demonstrates otherwise. Marcus faced this reality every day. He made the best decisions he could. He acted according to his principles. He tried to rule wisely. And then things happened that he did not intend. Consequences emerged that he did not foresee. People acted in ways he could not predict. The empire developed in directions he could not fully control. And every night, he had to release all of this, had to accept that he had done what he could, and the rest was not his to control. This is the first wisdom of Stoic sleep, understanding the dichotomy of control, recognizing what belongs to you and what does not, accepting your small domain and releasing everything else. And in that release, in that acceptance, in that surrender to what cannot be controlled, sleep becomes possible, rest becomes available, peace can arrive. Marcus wrote extensively about death, not in a morbid way, not obsessively, not with fear or anxiety, but as a daily meditation, as a regular reminder, as a constant source of perspective. Every night when he lay down, he recognized a simple truth. This could be the last time. This sleep could become permanent sleep. This release of consciousness could be the final release. This surrender to darkness could be the ultimate surrender. For most people, this thought would produce anxiety, would create fear, would prevent sleep rather than enable it. But for Marcus, this recognition had the opposite effect. It produced peace. It enabled rest. It helped him sleep. Why? Because recognizing mortality clarifies what truly matters. It strips away the trivial. It reveals the essential. It cuts through the superficial concerns that consume so much mental energy. and it helps a person let go of what does not actually matter, which upon honest examination is most of what consumed their day. Every human being will die. Not maybe, not possibly, not probably, certainly, definitely, inevitably. Death is the one absolutely guaranteed event in every human life. The timing is unknown, the manner is unknown, the location is unknown, but the fact of death is absolutely certain. And when death comes, when that final moment arrives, all the things that seemed so important during life will be revealed as the temporary concerns they actually were. All the problems that consumed so much mental energy will be shown to have been small troubles in a brief life. All the conflicts that seemed so significant will disappear completely. All the stress and anxiety and worry will be shown to have accomplished nothing except stealing peace from a limited existence. Marcus knew this. The emperor understood that his empire was temporary, that Rome, which seemed eternal, would eventually fall, that his power, which seemed absolute, was actually quite limited, that his life, regardless of his status, was brief, that his concerns, no matter how imperial, were temporary troubles in a temporary life. And this knowledge helped him sleep. It enabled him to release his daily concerns. It allowed him to accept that nothing he worried about today would matter after he died, that all his imperial responsibilities would transfer to someone else, that Rome would continue without him, just as Rome had existed before him, that the universe would proceed completely unaffected by his presence or absence. The human body is dying constantly. This is not a metaphor. This is biological fact. Cells die and are replaced. Organs gradually decline in function. Systems slowly degrade. Entropy increases steadily. Death is not an event that happens at the end of life. Death is a process that occurs throughout life. Every moment lived is a moment closer to the final moment. Every breath taken moves toward the last breath. Every day survived is one day less remaining. This recognition might seem depressing, might seem like it would create anxiety rather than peace, but the Stoics understood something important about mortality. They understood that death, being absolutely certain and completely unavoidable, does not deserve anxiety. Worrying about death accomplishes nothing. Fearing death changes nothing. Resisting death is futile. Death will come when it comes. The only choice is how to live with that knowledge. Marcus chose to use death as a teacher, as a source of perspective, as a reminder of what truly matters. If death could come tonight, if this sleep could be the final sleep, what would be worth worrying about? What problems would be worth carrying into the night? What concerns would be worth preventing rest? When viewed through the lens of mortality, most daily concerns shrink dramatically. The things that seemed so important, so urgent, so worthy of stress, are revealed as small troubles in a brief life, not unreal, not unimportant in the moment, but not worth sacrificing sleep, not worth stealing rest from a limited existence, not worth preventing peace in the short time available. Consider what seemed important 5 years ago, the problems that consumed mental energy then, the concerns that created stress, the worries that prevented sleep. How many of those things still matter now? How many can even be remembered clearly? Time has revealed most of them to have been temporary troubles that resolved themselves or became irrelevant or simply faded from importance. Death will do the same thing to today's concerns. We'll reveal them as temporary. We'll show them to have been small troubles in a brief life. We'll demonstrate that they were not worth the sleep they cost, the rest they prevented, the peace they stole. This is not nihilism in Marcus's philosophy, not the belief that nothing matters, but the recognition that most things matter less than we think they do, that most concerns are temporary, that most problems will pass, that most stress is about things that do not deserve to prevent sleep. Marcus was fighting actual wars when he wrote his meditations, real wars with real casualties. He was dealing with plague in the cities, real disease killing real people. He was facing political intrigue in Rome, real threats to his power and his life. He was managing an empire that stretched across the known world, real responsibilities affecting millions of lives. These were not imaginary problems, not trivial concerns, not minor stresses. These were real, significant, consequential issues. And yet Marcus recognized that even these imperial concerns were temporary troubles in a temporary life, that even the fate of Rome was a small matter in cosmic perspective, that even the most serious human problems were brief disturbances in an eternal universe. And recognizing this, understanding this deeply, allowed him to sleep, allowed him to release his concerns, allowed him to accept that he had done what he could during the day, and now it was time to rest, because life is short, because sleep is necessary, because worrying accomplishes nothing except stealing rest from a limited existence. The practice of memento mori, remembering death, is not meant to create fear or anxiety. It is meant to create clarity and perspective. It reminds a person that they have limited time, that their life will end, that their concerns, no matter how pressing they seem, are temporary troubles in a brief existence, and that sleep, rest, and peace are precious because time is limited. If this night could be the last night, if this sleep could be the final sleep, would it be worth spending it worrying? Would it be worth losing rest over problems that will either resolve themselves or not matter after death? Would it be worth preventing peace in exchange for stress about things that cannot be controlled? Marcus answered no. He chose rest. He chose peace. He chose sleep, not because his problems were not real, but because he understood that life is short and sleep is necessary, and worrying about death accomplishes nothing except stealing peace from life. Every night is practice for the final night. Every sleep is rehearsal for the final sleep. Every release of consciousness is training for the permanent release. And becoming good at this practice, becoming skilled at this release, becoming comfortable with this surrender, makes not only death easier to face eventually, but makes life easier to live daily. Because life requires constant letting go, constant acceptance of impermanence, constant recognition that everything is temporary and death is certain. Marcus understood this, practiced this, lived according to this wisdom, and it allowed him to sleep peacefully despite carrying the weight of the world, despite facing problems that would overwhelm most people, despite responsibilities that would crush ordinary humans. He could sleep because he accepted his mortality, because he recognized the temporary nature of all his concerns, because he understood that death was certain and worrying about it was pointless. This is the second wisdom of Stoic sleep. Remember death, not to create fear, but to create perspective, not to generate anxiety, but to generate clarity. Use mortality as a teacher, as a reminder of what matters, as a source of peace. Because if death is certain and timing is uncertain, then sleep is more valuable than worry. Rest is more important than stress. Peace is more precious than anxiety about problems that are temporary troubles in a brief life. Marcus was deeply concerned with virtue, with being a good person, with acting rightly regardless of outcomes, with maintaining character despite circumstances, with living according to principles despite pressure to compromise them. This focus on virtue, this commitment to character, was not separate from his ability to sleep. It was essential to it. Because Marcus focused on what he could control, his character and his intentions, and released what he could not control, the results and consequences of his actions. Every evening, Marcus would examine his day, not to judge whether he had succeeded or failed in worldly terms, not to measure whether outcomes had been favorable, not to assess whether his actions had produced the results he desired, but to examine whether he had tried to act rightly, whether he had made efforts to be a good person, whether his intentions had been virtuous, even if outcomes had not been what he hoped. Did he try to be kind during the day? That is what matters in Stoic philosophy, not whether others received the kindness well, not whether kindness produced desired results, not whether being kind had worked out advantageously, but whether the effort was made, whether the intention was good, whether the character was expressed through the attempt. Did he try to be honest, even when honesty was difficult? Even when honesty created conflict, even when truth was uncomfortable? The attempt at honesty is what belonged to him. The intention to be truthful was within his control. The commitment to truth was his responsibility. The outcome of being honest, that was not his to control. Did he try to be just, to treat people fairly, to act with integrity? Perhaps he had failed. Perhaps he had fallen short of his ideals. Perhaps he had made mistakes. But did he try? Did he intend justice? Did he aim for fairness? This intention, this effort, this commitment was his domain. This is what he could control. This is what he could examine as he prepared for sleep. The outcomes of the day are already determined by the time night arrives, already fixed in the past, already beyond anyone's power to change. A person cannot alter what has already happened, cannot modify outcomes by worrying about them, cannot improve results by staying awake thinking about them. What happened has happened. The only question is whether the person tried to act well, whether their character was good, whether their intentions were virtuous. Marcus wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." This was his bedtime philosophy. Do not worry about whether you succeeded at being good in terms of results. Just examine whether you tried to be good, whether you intended virtue, whether you aimed for good character. The trying is sufficient. The effort is what counts. The intention is what belongs to you. Human beings are imperfect. They fail. They fall short of their ideals. They make mistakes. They act less virtuously than they intend. They compromise their principles. They violate their own values. They disappoint themselves. Marcus made mistakes too. The emperor made errors. The philosopher made poor choices. The powerful man made bad decisions. But he examined his intentions. He reviewed his efforts. He focused on his character development. He committed to improvement. He accepted his imperfection while striving for better. And having done this examination, having reviewed his character, having acknowledged his efforts and his failures, he could sleep. He could release the day. He could rest, knowing that he had tried to be a good person, and that was what mattered. That was what belonged to him. That was what he could control. The Stoics made a crucial distinction. They distinguished between what they called preferred indifference and actual goods. Wealth, health, success, favorable outcomes, these are preferred indifference. They are preferable to their opposites. It is better to be wealthy than poor, healthy than sick, successful than unsuccessful, but they are not actual goods, because they are not entirely within our control. The only actual good, according to Stoic philosophy, is virtue, good character, right intention, moral effort. These are goods because they are within our control. A person can choose to try to be virtuous, can decide to aim for good character, can commit to right intentions, regardless of outcomes, regardless of circumstances, regardless of results. This focus on virtue rather than outcomes is what allowed Marcus to sleep, because outcomes are not entirely within control. A person can act virtuously and have things turn out badly, can make the right choice and have it lead to poor results, can do the right thing and have others respond negatively. The outcomes are not entirely within their control. But virtue is within control. Character is within control. Intention is within control. A person can always choose to try to be good, can always aim for right action, can always commit to virtuous intention. And having done this, having made this effort, having committed to this aim, they can rest, can sleep, can release the outcomes that are not within their control. Marcus examined whether he had tried to be good that day, whether he had aimed for virtue, whether his intentions had been right, not whether he had succeeded in producing good outcomes, not whether others had recognized his virtue, not whether his efforts had been rewarded, just whether he had tried, whether he had aimed. And if the answer was yes, even imperfectly, even inadequately, even with failures and shortcomings, then that was sufficient. That was enough. That was what allowed him to rest, because he had done what was within his control. He had exercised his small sovereignty over his own character. He had governed his own intentions, and the rest, all the outcomes and consequences and results, existed outside his control, and therefore outside his responsibility as he prepared to sleep. This is not a lowering of standards, not an excuse for poor behavior, not a justification for inadequate effort. Marcus held himself to the highest standards of virtue, but he understood the difference between trying to be virtuous, which was within his control, and succeeding in producing virtuous outcomes, which was not entirely within his control. A person can be kind and have their kindness rejected, can be honest and have their honesty create conflict, can be just and have their justice produce unfavorable results. The outcomes depend on many factors beyond individual control, but the character, the intention, the effort, these belong to the individual. These are within their control. These are what can be examined as they prepare for sleep, and having examined their character, having reviewed their intentions, having acknowledged their efforts both successful and unsuccessful, they can rest, can release the day, can accept that they did what was within their control, and everything else unfolded according to factors beyond their control. The world will respond to actions according to its own nature. Other people will react according to their own characters. Situations will develop according to forces beyond any individual's control. Consequences will emerge from complex causes that no single person fully controls. This is the nature of reality. This is how the world works. Marcus could not control how the world responded to his efforts at virtue, could not guarantee that his good intentions would produce good results, could not ensure that his right actions would lead to favorable outcomes. All he could control was his character, his intentions, his efforts, and having controlled these, having exercised his small sovereignty, he could release everything else and sleep. This is the third wisdom of Stoic sleep. Focus on virtue rather than outcomes. Examine character rather than results. Review intentions rather than consequences, because character is within control and outcomes are not, because virtue can always be chosen and results cannot always be produced, because trying to be good is sufficient for peace, even when being good does not produce the outcomes desired. Marcus practiced what the Stoics called negative visualization, the practice of imagining loss before it occurs, imagining loved ones dying, imagining possessions being taken, imagining status being lost, imagining health failing. To modern minds, this practice seems morbid, seems depressing, seems like it would create anxiety rather than peace. But in Stoic philosophy, negative visualization served a specific purpose. It prepared a person for losses that would inevitably come, and it helped them appreciate what they had while they still had it. The Stoics understood a fundamental truth about human existence. Everything is temporary. Everything that is gained will eventually be lost. Everyone who is loved will eventually die or leave. Everything that is built will eventually crumble. This is not pessimism. This is reality. This is the nature of existence in time. Most people avoid thinking about this reality. They prefer to believe that what they have will last, that who they love will always be there, that their circumstances will remain stable. This belief is comforting in the short term, but it sets them up for devastation when loss inevitably occurs, and it prevents them from fully appreciating what they have while they have it. Marcus took a different approach. Every day he would remind himself that everything he had was temporary, that everyone he loved was mortal, that all his circumstances could change, not to create fear, but to create appreciation, not to generate anxiety, but to generate presence, not to induce worry, but to induce gratitude for what exists now. When he saw his children, he would remind himself that they were mortal, that any moment with them could be the last, not to make himself sad, but to make himself present, to pay attention, to appreciate, to love them fully while they were still alive, while the opportunity for love still existed. Marcus lost many of his children during his lifetime. Multiple children died before he did. These were devastating losses, painful beyond description, but the negative visualization he had practiced did not prevent the pain, did not eliminate the grief. It did something different. It prevented the additional suffering of regret. It prevented him from thinking, I should have appreciated them more while they were alive. Because he had appreciated them, he had been present, he had loved them fully, he had known they were temporary, and had valued them accordingly. Everything that any person has is borrowed. Their health is borrowed from time, and time will eventually take it back. Their relationships are borrowed from mortality, and death will eventually end them. Their possessions are borrowed from circumstance, and circumstances will eventually change. Nothing is truly owned. Nothing is permanent. Everything is temporary. The Stoics understood this deeply, and rather than denying it or avoiding it, they faced it directly. They practiced imagining loss, not to create suffering in advance, but to create appreciation in the present, not to rehearse grief, but to rehearse gratitude. If a person knew they would lose their health tomorrow, they would wish they had appreciated their health more today. If they knew a loved one would die tomorrow, they would wish they had been more present today. If they knew their circumstances would change tomorrow, they would wish they had been more grateful today. Negative visualization brings this recognition into the present. It asks, what if tomorrow brings loss? How should that possibility change how I experience today? The answer is not to be anxious, not to worry, not to be sad. The answer is to be present, to appreciate, to be grateful, to recognize that what you have now is temporary and therefore precious, to value what exists while it exists, to love what is here while it is still here. This practice helped Marcus sleep because it helped him release grasping, release clinging, release the desperate attempt to hold on to what cannot be held. He appreciated what he had. He was present with what existed. He valued what was there, and then he released it. Let it be temporary. Let it be borrowed. Let it exist without his desperate need for it to be permanent. Sleep itself is a small death, a temporary loss of consciousness, a brief surrender of control, a short release from the world. And someone who has practiced negative visualization, who has imagined permanent loss, finds it easier to accept temporary loss, finds it easier to let go each night, finds it easier to release consciousness into sleep. Marcus would sometimes practice an extreme form of negative visualization. He would imagine that he had already died, that his life was already over, that he had already lost everything. And then he would recognize that he still had this moment, this breath, this experience, this existence, as if it were a bonus, as if it were an unexpected gift, as if he had been given a second chance. This practice transformed how he experienced his life. Instead of taking existence for granted, he received it as grace. Instead of demanding that things last, he appreciated them while they lasted. Instead of grasping for permanence, he accepted impermanence. And this acceptance, this appreciation, this gratitude made sleep possible, made rest available, made peace accessible. The Buddhist tradition has a similar practice, contemplating impermanence, recognizing that all things are temporary, that all formations arise and pass away, that nothing lasts. This recognition, far from being depressing, is liberating. It frees a person from the suffering of clinging, from the pain of demanding permanence from an impermanent world. The Stoics arrived at the same wisdom through a different path, through negative visualization, through practicing loss before loss occurred, through imagining endings before endings came. And in that practice they found peace, found appreciation, found the ability to hold things lightly, to love without grasping, to value without clinging, to experience without demanding. Every night when Marcus lay down, he had practiced this, had imagined loss, had accepted impermanence, had recognized that everything he had was temporary. And this recognition did not prevent him from sleeping. It enabled him to sleep, because he had released the desperate need for things to be permanent, had accepted that everything passes, had made peace with impermanence. The person who cannot accept impermanence cannot sleep well, because sleep requires letting go, requires releasing, requires accepting temporary loss of consciousness. And someone who desperately needs things to be permanent, who cannot accept that everything changes, who demands that what they have will last, struggles to let go each night, struggles to release, struggles to accept even the temporary loss that sleep represents. But the person who has practiced negative visualization, who has accepted impermanence, who has made peace with the temporary nature of all things, finds sleep easier, finds release more natural, finds surrender more graceful, because they have practiced letting go, have rehearsed acceptance, have trained in release. This is the fourth wisdom of Stoic sleep. Practice negative visualization, not to create anxiety, but to create appreciation, not to rehearse suffering, but to rehearse gratitude. Imagine loss to increase presence, contemplate endings to value beginnings, accept impermanence to find peace, because everything is temporary and denying this creates suffering, but accepting it creates the ability to sleep, to rest, to let go each night. Marcus wrote about what he called the inner citadel, the fortress within every person that cannot be breached by external events, the sovereign space inside where a person is always safe, always free, always themselves. This inner citadel was not a metaphor for Marcus. It was a lived reality, a practice he engaged in daily, a refuge he returned to regularly, especially at night, especially when preparing for sleep. The external world is chaos. It is unpredictable. It is often hostile. It makes demands, creates pressures, causes stress, produces anxiety. For the Emperor of Rome, these external pressures were immense. The weight of an empire, the demands of millions of people, the threats from barbarian tribes, the problems of plague and famine and political intrigue. But inside, in what Marcus called his inner citadel, none of these external forces could reach him. Inside he was safe. Inside he was sovereign. Inside he was free. Not free from the external pressures which continued to exist, but free from being controlled by them, free from being determined by them, free from being overwhelmed by them. This inner citadel is not a place. It is not a physical location. It is a mental state, a psychological reality. The recognition that while external events can affect circumstances, they cannot control the inner self unless permission is granted, cannot determine character unless allowed, cannot rule the sovereign self unless sovereignty is surrendered. Marcus would, at the end of each day, retreat to this inner citadel, would turn his attention inward, would return to himself, would come home to the self that existed beneath all his roles, all his responsibilities, all his external identities. During the day, he was emperor, was commander, was judge, was administrator. He wore many roles, fulfilled many functions, met many expectations, but these were external. These were roles he played. These were not his essential self. At night, returning to his inner citadel, he was just Marcus, just a human being, just consciousness, just the essential self that existed beneath all the roles. And in that return, in that retreat, he found rest, found peace, found the ability to release all the external demands and simply be. Every person carries roles during their day, employee or employer, parent or child, partner or single, friend or stranger. Each role has expectations, has demands, has pressures. Each role requires performing, requires meeting expectations, requires maintaining appearances. This is exhausting, the constant performing, the constant meeting of expectations, the constant wearing of masks. By the end of the day, a person is tired not just from physical activity, but from psychological performance, from being who others need them to be rather than who they simply are. The inner citadel is the place where all these roles can be set aside, where all performances can cease, where all masks can be removed, where a person can simply be themselves, not performing for anyone, not meeting any expectations, not wearing any masks, just being the essential self that exists beneath all roles. This retreat to the inner citadel is essential for sleep, because sleep requires letting go of all doing, all performing, all meeting of expectations. Sleep requires being rather than doing, and the person who has not learned to retreat to their inner citadel, who has not found this place of simply being, struggles to sleep because they cannot stop performing, cannot stop trying to meet expectations, cannot stop being who they think they should be. Marcus understood that external power was nothing compared to internal sovereignty, that ruling an empire was nothing compared to ruling oneself, that commanding millions was nothing compared to commanding one's own mind. The external power was vast but ultimately hollow. The internal sovereignty was small but ultimately real. The external world can take away many things, can remove possessions, can destroy status, can eliminate relationships, can change circumstances, but it cannot enter the inner citadel unless invited, cannot control the essential self unless that control is surrendered, cannot rule the sovereign within unless sovereignty is abdicated. This recognition gave Marcus peace, gave him the ability to sleep despite external chaos, despite problems he could not solve, despite pressures he could not eliminate, because inside his inner citadel he was safe, was sovereign, was free. The problems remained outside. The chaos continued in the external world, but inside there was peace. The practice of retreating to the inner citadel is simple but profound. It requires turning attention inward, recognizing the self that exists beneath all roles, acknowledging the consciousness that persists through all changes, coming home to the essential being that is always there, always accessible, always sovereign. This is not escape from responsibility, not avoidance of external demands. Marcus did not abandon his empire by retreating to his inner citadel. He returned to himself so that he could rest, so that he could sleep, so that he could recover the strength needed to face the external world again the next day. The person who never retreats to their inner citadel, who is always performing externally, who never comes home to themselves, eventually exhausts themselves completely. They have no place to rest, no refuge, no home within themselves. They are always out in the world, always performing, always meeting others' expectations, never simply being themselves. Sleep becomes difficult for such people, because sleep requires ceasing all external performance, requires letting go of all roles, requires coming home to the self. And if a person does not know how to do this, if they have never found their inner citadel, sleep remains elusive. Marcus wrote, "Nowhere can a person find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in their own soul." This was not mere poetry. This was description of lived experience. The external world offered no quiet. The empire offered no rest. The palace offered no peace. But inside, in his own soul, in his inner citadel, there was always quiet, always rest, always peace. This inner peace did not depend on external circumstances, did not require problems to be solved, did not need the world to be different than it was. It simply existed as a possibility, as a refuge, as a home that could always be returned to. The body needs rest, needs sleep, needs recovery from the day's exertions, but the mind also needs rest, needs retreat, needs return to the inner citadel, where it can simply be rather than constantly do. Marcus practiced this return every night, would set aside his role as emperor, would cease being commander of armies, would stop being judge and administrator and all the other functions he fulfilled, would return to simply being Marcus, simply being himself, simply being consciousness at rest. And in that return, in that retreat, in that homecoming to himself, he found the peace necessary for sleep, found the quiet necessary for rest, found the sovereignty that allowed him to surrender control of the external world for the night. This is the fifth wisdom of Stoic sleep. Retreat to your inner citadel, return to yourself, come home to the essential self that exists beneath all roles. Find the sovereign space within where you are always safe, where external chaos cannot reach, where peace is always available, because sleep requires this retreat, requires this return, requires coming home to yourself before you can rest. The Stoics practiced something they called the view from above, the practice of seeing human concerns from cosmic perspective, of imagining oneself from great height or great distance, of recognizing how small individual problems appear when seen from the perspective of the whole. Marcus practiced this regularly, would imagine Rome from high above, would see the city as a small cluster of buildings on a peninsula, would recognize how tiny his concerns were when seen from that height, would understand how brief his life was when measured against cosmic time. This practice might seem like it would make a person feel insignificant, would create a sense of meaninglessness, would lead to despair at the smallness of human existence. But for Marcus, it had the opposite effect. It created peace. It provided relief. It enabled sleep. Why? Because most human suffering comes from taking concerns too seriously, from believing that personal problems are cosmically significant, from thinking that individual struggles are universally important. The view from above corrects this misunderstanding. It reveals human concerns at their actual scale, which is very small, and this revelation is liberating. Consider a person lying in bed unable to sleep because of worries, about work, about relationships, about money, about health, about countless other concerns. These concerns feel enormous, feel overwhelming, feel like they matter immensely, and they do matter to that person in that moment, but they do not matter cosmically, do not matter universally, do not matter at the scale of galaxies and billions of years. The view from above does not eliminate the concerns, does not solve the problems, does not make the worries disappear, but it changes their scale. It reveals them as the small troubles they actually are, as temporary difficulties in a brief life on a small planet in a vast universe. Marcus would imagine himself rising above Rome, above Italy, above the Mediterranean, above the earth itself, looking back at the planet from space, seeing it as a small blue sphere in the vast darkness, recognizing that his concerns, which felt so large, were invisible at that scale, were microscopic, were utterly insignificant when measured against the cosmos. This recognition did not depress him, did not make him feel that nothing mattered. Instead, it freed him from the tyranny of taking his concerns too seriously. It allowed him to see them accurately, to recognize that they were small troubles that did not deserve to prevent his sleep, that did not warrant stealing his rest, that did not merit robbing his peace. The universe is vast beyond human comprehension, contains billions of galaxies, each galaxy containing billions of stars, each star potentially having planets. The scale is so large that human minds cannot truly grasp it. Human problems, human concerns, human struggles, all of it is invisible at cosmic scale, utterly insignificant, completely negligible. This could be seen as a depressing truth, could be interpreted as meaning that nothing humans do matters, could lead to nihilism and despair. But the Stoics interpreted it differently. They saw cosmic insignificance as liberation, as permission to stop taking themselves so seriously, as freedom from the belief that their personal concerns were cosmically important. If human concerns are cosmically insignificant, then they are not worth preventing sleep, not worth stealing rest, not worth robbing peace. They are worth addressing during waking hours, worth working on when conscious, worth dealing with when able. But they are not worth carrying into the night, not worth preventing rest, not worth sacrificing sleep. Marcus understood this, practiced this, lived according to this wisdom. He dealt with his concerns during the day, worked on problems when conscious, made decisions when able, but at night he let them go, released them, accepted that they were small troubles on a small planet in a vast universe, and that recognition, that perspective, that cosmic view allowed him to sleep. The view from above also provides perspective on time. Human life is brief. Even a long human life is a blink in cosmic time. The universe has existed for billions of years, will likely continue for billions more. An individual human life is a tiny fragment of cosmic time, utterly brief, completely temporary. This recognition could be seen as making life meaningless, could be interpreted as suggesting that human existence does not matter. But again, the Stoics interpreted it differently. They saw the brevity of life as making it precious, as creating urgency to live well, as eliminating the excuse to waste time on what does not truly matter. If life is brief, if time is limited, then sleep is precious, rest is valuable, peace is important. Wasting the limited nights available to worry about problems is a poor use of finite time. The brief life deserves rest, the limited time deserves peace, the temporary existence deserves sleep. Marcus would combine spatial perspective with temporal perspective, would see his life as a brief moment on a small planet in a vast universe, would recognize that his concerns, which felt so pressing, were temporary troubles in a brief existence in an eternal cosmos, would understand that worrying about these concerns accomplished nothing and cost something precious, rest from a finite life. This double perspective, seeing the smallness of human existence in space and time, provided profound peace. Not the peace of solving all problems, not the peace of having favorable circumstances, but the peace of accurate perspective, the peace of seeing things as they actually are, the peace of recognizing that cosmic insignificance is liberation, not burden. The person who believes their concerns are cosmically significant cannot sleep well, because those concerns feel too important to release, too pressing to set aside, too significant to stop thinking about. But the person who has gained cosmic perspective, who has practiced the view from above, who recognizes the actual scale of human concerns, can release them each night, can set them aside, can stop thinking about them, because they understand that these concerns, while real and worth addressing, are not cosmically significant, not universally important, not worth preventing sleep in a brief life. This is not an excuse to ignore problems, not a justification for irresponsibility. Marcus did not neglect his duties because he recognized their cosmic insignificance. He fulfilled his responsibilities. He dealt with problems. He made decisions. But he did not let those responsibilities, problems, and decisions prevent his sleep, did not let them steal his rest, did not let them rob his peace. The view from above is a practice, something to be done regularly, not once, but repeatedly, because human minds naturally return to taking concerns too seriously, naturally slip back into believing that personal problems are cosmically important. The practice must be repeated, the perspective must be refreshed, the view must be taken again and again. Marcus practiced this every night, would imagine himself from cosmic perspective, would see his concerns from vast distance, would recognize their actual scale, would understand their true significance, which was very small. And having gained this perspective, having seen clearly, having recognized the truth, he could sleep, could rest, could let go of concerns that did not deserve to prevent his peace. This is the sixth wisdom of Stoic sleep. Practice the view from above, gain cosmic perspective, see human concerns at their actual scale, recognize that personal problems, while real, are cosmically insignificant, understand that they are not worth preventing sleep, not worth stealing rest, not worth robbing peace from a brief life in a vast universe, because accurate perspective is liberating, because seeing truly enables releasing, because cosmic view allows earthly rest. Marcus Aurelius died in the year 1800 CE in a military camp near Vienna. He was still emperor, still responsible for Rome, still carrying the weight of an empire, but he had been practicing dying for many years. Every night when he went to sleep, every time he released consciousness, every moment he surrendered control. When death finally came, he was ready, had been ready for years, had practiced the release thousands of times, had rehearsed the surrender repeatedly, had trained in letting go consistently. His last words, according to some accounts, were, "Go to the rising sun, for I am setting." Poetry in the face of death, philosophy at the moment of ending, Stoic wisdom expressed even in final breath. He had practiced this moment every night, not morbidly, not with fear, not with anxiety, but as simple recognition that sleep is small death, that releasing consciousness each night is rehearsal for releasing it permanently, that surrendering control each evening is training for surrendering it finally. Every person practices dying every night. They just do not recognize it as such. They think they are merely sleeping, merely resting, merely letting go for the night. But what is sleep except small death? What is unconsciousness except temporary ending? What is surrendering to sleep except practice for surrendering to death? The person who struggles to fall asleep is struggling with a small death, is resisting temporary ending, is fighting surrender, is trying to maintain control when control must be released. And this struggle makes sleep difficult, makes rest elusive, makes peace impossible. But the person who has recognized sleep as practice for death, who has understood that letting go each night is rehearsal for letting go permanently, who has accepted that consciousness must be released daily before it is released finally, this person finds sleep easier, finds rest more natural, finds surrender more graceful. Marcus understood this, practiced this, lived according to this wisdom for many years, and when actual death came, when the practice became reality, when the rehearsal became performance, he was ready, had been ready, had practiced sufficiently. The Stoics did not fear death, not because they were brave, not because they were stoic in the modern sense of emotionless, but because they understood death correctly, understood it as natural, as inevitable, as nothing to fear because nothing can be done about it. Fear is appropriate for things that can be avoided. Death cannot be avoided. Therefore, death does not warrant fear. This does not mean the Stoics wanted to die, did not mean they sought death, did not mean they were indifferent to living. They valued life. They wanted to live. They worked to preserve life. But they did not fear the death that would inevitably come, did not waste energy resisting the unavoidable, did not suffer from anxiety about the inevitable. And every night, they practiced this acceptance, this recognition that death is natural, this understanding that endings are inevitable, this peace with the fact that consciousness is temporary. They practiced by sleeping, by releasing consciousness, by surrendering control, by accepting temporary death as preparation for permanent death. Sleep cannot be forced, cannot be controlled, cannot be commanded. It requires surrender, requires release, requires letting go of control. And the person who has difficulty surrendering during sleep will have difficulty surrendering at death. But the person who has practiced surrender thousands of times, who has released control repeatedly, who has let go consistently, finds that final surrender easier. This is not about being eager for death, not about welcoming ending, not about desiring cessation. This is about being prepared, about being practiced, about being skilled in the art of letting go, because letting go is required, daily in sleep, finally in death, and the person who has never learned to let go suffers twice, suffers from inability to sleep, and suffers from terror of death. Marcus practiced letting go every night for decades, practiced surrender, practiced release, practiced accepting loss of control, and after decades of practice, after thousands of rehearsals, after countless repetitions, the final performance was easy, was natural, was simply the last in a long series of similar surrenders. The human tendency is to resist endings, to fight against loss, to struggle against surrender. This resistance is natural, is understandable, is built into survival instinct, but it creates suffering, because some endings cannot be resisted, some losses cannot be prevented, some surrenders cannot be avoided, and the energy spent resisting the inevitable is energy wasted. Is peace sacrificed? Is rest prevented? Better to accept, to recognize, to understand that endings come, that loss is inevitable, that surrender is required, and to practice this acceptance, this recognition, this understanding, daily, nightly, repeatedly, so that when the final ending comes, when the ultimate loss arrives, when the complete surrender is required, the person is ready, has practiced, has learned the art of letting go. This is the seventh and final wisdom of Stoic sleep. Recognize sleep as practice for death. Understand that surrendering consciousness each night is rehearsal for surrendering it permanently. Accept that letting go is required, both temporarily and ultimately. Practice this surrender. Practice this release. Practice this acceptance. Not morbidly, not with fear, but with recognition that this is nature, this is reality. This is what consciousness does. It arises, it exists, it fades, daily in sleep, finally in death. And the person who has practiced this, who has understood this, who has accepted this, sleeps peacefully, rests deeply, surrenders gracefully each night until the final night. When the practice becomes permanent, when the rehearsal becomes reality, when the temporary surrender becomes the ultimate release, Marcus understood this, practiced this, lived this. And when his time came, when his setting sun moment arrived, when his final surrender was required, he was ready, had been ready for years, had practiced dying every night. And the final death was simply the completion of a practice he had engaged in thousands of times before. This is what he knew about sleep. This is what allowed him to rest despite the weight of empire. This is what enabled him to surrender despite his power. This is what permitted him to let go despite his responsibilities. He understood that sleep is small death, that rest requires surrender, that peace demands letting go, and he practiced this understanding every night for many years until the practice became skill, until the rehearsal became performance, until the temporary became permanent. And now, more than 1800 years later, his words remain, his philosophy endures, his wisdom teaches, because what he understood about sleep is true for all humans, in all times, in all places. Sleep requires surrender. Rest demands letting go. Peace needs acceptance. And the person who learns this, who practices this, who understands this, finds what Marcus found: the ability to sleep despite concerns, the capacity to rest despite problems, the skill of surrendering despite the desire to control. This is the Stoic way of sleep. This is the emperor's bedtime philosophy. This is Marcus Aurelius's gift to all who struggle with rest. The recognition that control is limited, that mortality is certain, that virtue is what matters, that loss is inevitable, that the inner citadel is always available, that cosmic perspective is liberating, and that sleep is practice for the final surrender that awaits every human being. May this understanding bring peace. May this recognition enable rest. May this wisdom allow sleep, as it did for Marcus, as it has for Stoics throughout history, as it can for anyone who practices these principles, who accepts these truths, who lives according to this philosophy. The day ends, the night arrives, the time for rest has come, and with it the opportunity to practice what Marcus practiced, to understand what he understood, to find what he found: peace in surrender, rest in release, sleep in acceptance. This is the way of Stoic sleep. This is the path of philosophical rest. This is Marcus Aurelius's bedtime wisdom. May it serve well all who seek peaceful sleep in a chaotic world.